Captain Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her brow as she walked across the scorching tarmac at Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but she had grown accustomed to the heat during her 6-month deployment. What she couldn't get used to was the constant reminder that her F-16 Fighting Falcon was considered the backup option for every major mission. The briefing room was filled with the usual suspects, 12 male pilots, all seasoned veterans who had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. Sarah took her usual seat in the back corner, listening as Colonel Harrison outlined the day's reconnaissance mission over hostile territory. Intelligence reports suggested enemy surface-to-air missile sites had been repositioned along the border, and command needed visual confirmation. "Thompson, you'll take lead," Colonel Harrison announced, pointing to Major Rick Thompson, a cocky pilot with over 200 combat hours. "Martinez will fly your wing. Mitchell, you'll maintain holding pattern at the rally point as backup support." Sarah's jaw tightened. Once again, she was relegated to backup status, circling uselessly while the real action happened elsewhere. She had graduated top of her class at the Air Force Academy, excelled in flight school, and completed advanced combat training with flying colors. Yet here she was, treated like a spare tire that would only be used if everything else failed. After the briefing, she found herself alone in the equipment room, suiting up in her flight gear. The familiar weight of the G-suit, the helmet's snug fit, and the oxygen mask dangling at her side brought comfort. In the cockpit, rank and gender meant nothing. Only skill mattered, and Sarah knew she had plenty of that. Major Thompson appeared in the doorway, his signature smirk plastered across his face. "Don't worry, Mitchell. Maybe next time you'll get to see some real action instead of flying circles in the sky." Sarah didn't respond. She had learned long ago that engaging with Thompson's taunts only made things worse. Instead, she focused on her pre-flight checklist, methodically going through each item with practiced precision. As she walked toward her aircraft, Sarah couldn't help but admire the sleek lines of the F-16. The single-engine fighter was a marvel of engineering, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2, armed with a 20mm cannon and hardpoints for various missiles and bombs. Her particular aircraft, tail number 880123, had been her faithful companion for the entire deployment. The ground crew chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, greeted her with a smile. "She's ready to fly, Captain. Fuel's topped off, all systems green." "Thanks, Rodriguez. Any word from intelligence about updated threats?" "Nothing new, ma'am. Same old story. Possible SAM sites, scattered enemy patrols, and radio chatter suggesting increased activity in Sector 7. Sarah nodded and began her exterior inspection. She checked the aircraft's skin for damage, examined the engine intake for foreign objects, and verified that all external weapons were properly secured. Her bird was carrying 2 AM-120 AMRAAM missiles and a full load of 20mm ammunition. Standard configuration for a reconnaissance mission. Climbing into the cockpit felt like coming home. The familiar arrangement of switches, displays, and controls surrounded her like an old friend's embrace. She strapped herself in, connected her oxygen hose and communication cables, and began the engine start sequence. The Pratt & Whitney F-100 engine came to life with a distinctive whine that gradually built to a powerful roar. Sarah ran through her systems checks. Radar, navigation, weapons, communications, everything was functioning perfectly. Desert flight. "This is Tower. You're cleared for taxi to runway 09. Tower, desert flight copies. Taxi to 09. Sarah watched as Thompson and Martinez taxied ahead of her, their aircraft gleaming in the afternoon sun. She followed at the prescribed distance, her mind already shifting into combat mode, despite the routine nature of the mission. During the taxi, she reviewed the mission parameters one more time. They would fly northeast toward the border, maintaining radio silence once they entered contested airspace. Thompson and Martinez would conduct the actual reconnaissance while she remained at the rally point, ready to provide assistance if needed. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Sarah watched the 2 lead aircraft disappear into the blue sky. When her turn came, she pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar surge of acceleration. The F-16 leaped off the runway like a thoroughbred released from the starting gate. As she climbed to altitude, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this mission. The intelligence briefing had been vague, and the enemy activity reports seemed more scattered than usual. Her instincts, honed by years of training and combat experience, were telling her to stay alert. The flight to the rally point was uneventful. Sarah established a racetrack pattern at 25,000 feet, maintaining radio silence as briefed. Through her headset, she could hear the occasional burst of encrypted communication between Thompson and Martinez as they approached the target area. 20 minutes into the hold, her radar warning receiver began chirping softly. Someone was painting her aircraft with radar, but the signal was weak and intermittent. Sarah immediately began defensive maneuvering, varying her altitude and heading to make herself a more difficult target. The radio crackled to life with Thompson's voice, tense and urgent. Desert 2-1, we have multiple SAM sites active. More than intelligence reported. Requesting immediate support. Sarah's heart rate increased as she waited for clearance to join the fight. This was what she had trained for, what she had been waiting for throughout the entire deployment. Finally, she might get the chance to prove that she belonged in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. Colonel Harrison's voice came through the radio, clear and authoritative. Desert 2-3, you are cleared to provide support. Use caution. Enemy air defenses are more extensive than anticipated. Sarah banked hard toward the target area, her F-16 responding instantly to her inputs. The backup pilot was finally being called into action, and she intended to make the most of the opportunity. Little did she know that this mission would change everything, not just for her but for every pilot who had ever underestimated her capabilities. Sarah's F-16 streaked through the clear desert sky at 450 knots, rapidly closing the distance to the target area. Her radar display showed Thompson and Martinez approximately 40 miles ahead, weaving erratically as they tried to avoid the growing number of surface-to-air missile threats. The radio chatter had become increasingly frantic over the past few minutes. Intelligence had severely underestimated the enemy's air defense network. What was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission had quickly evolved into a life-or-death struggle against a sophisticated missile defense system. Desert 2-1, I'm spiked. Martinez's voice crackled through the radio, using the code word that meant enemy radar had locked onto his aircraft. SAM launch, I'm defensive. Sarah pushed her throttle to military power, coaxing every bit of speed from her aircraft. Through her heads-up display, she could see the target area ahead, a valley surrounded by low hills where the enemy had cleverly positioned their missile sites to create overlapping fields of fire. Her radar warning receiver was now screaming, constantly, indicating multiple threats from different directions. Sarah's training kicked in as she analyzed the tactical situation. The enemy had set a trap, using false intelligence to lure coalition aircraft into a carefully prepared kill zone. Desert 2-3, this is 2-1. We're taking heavy fire. Multiple SA-15 and SA-20 sites active. Request immediate SEAD support. Thompson's voice had lost its usual cockiness, replaced by the controlled panic of a pilot fighting for his life. Suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD, was exactly what Sarah had trained for during countless hours in the simulator. But she was flying alone, without the specialized anti-radiation missiles typically used for such missions. Her aircraft carried only air-to-air missiles and her 20mm cannon. As she crested a ridge at low altitude, Sarah finally saw the battlefield spread out below her. Two F-16s were jinxing desperately through the valley, white contrails marking the paths of surface-to-air missiles streaking toward them. Multiple radar sites dotted the surrounding hills, their antennas tracking the American aircraft with deadly precision. Sarah made a split-second decision that would define her military career. Instead of maintaining altitude and providing defensive support as doctrine demanded, she rolled inverted and dove toward the nearest radar site. Her unconventional approach caught the enemy operators off guard. They were focused on the two aircraft in the valley and didn't immediately react to the threat diving down from above. At 8,000 feet, Sarah pulled out of her dive and lined up on the first SA-20 site. The sophisticated Russian-made system was capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Destroying it would significantly reduce the threat to her wingmen. Sarah armed her 20mm cannon and selected the appropriate firing mode. The M61A1 Vulcan cannon could fire 6,000 rounds per minute, turning her F-16 into a flying artillery piece. She had 501 rounds available, enough for several high-precision attacks if she made every shot count. The enemy radar operators finally spotted her approach and began tracking her aircraft. Missile launch warnings filled her headset as two SA-15 short-range missiles lifted off from a nearby site. Sarah continued her attack run, knowing that breaking off now would leave Thompson and Martinez trapped in the kill zone. At 4,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The F-16 shuddered as the cannon unleashed a stream of 20mm depleted uranium projectiles toward the radar antenna. Sarah watched through her targeting display as the rounds impacted exactly where she had aimed. The radar dish disintegrated in a shower of sparks and debris. Now she had to deal with the incoming missiles. Sarah pulled hard on the stick, subjecting herself to over 7 Gs as she maneuvered to avoid the SA-15s. The missiles, designed to engage aircraft flying predictable patterns, couldn't adjust quickly enough to her violent defensive maneuvers. "Holy shit, Mitchell." Thompson's voice came through the radio, filled with amazement. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" Sarah didn't have time to respond. Her radar warning receiver was indicating 2 more SA-20 sites had locked onto her aircraft. She was now the primary target, drawing the enemy's attention away from Thompson and Martinez. Banking hard to the left, Sarah spotted the second radar site positioned on a hilltop approximately 3 miles away. This time, the operators were ready for her. As she began her attack run, multiple missiles launched simultaneously from different positions. Sarah found herself flying through a 3-dimensional maze of surface-to-air missiles, each one guided by sophisticated computer systems and capable of pulling over 30 Gs in pursuit of her aircraft. She rolled right, then left, pulled up into a climb, then dove toward the ground using every technique she had learned to avoid becoming another casualty statistic. The second attack run was even more precise than the first. Sarah's cannon rounds walked across the hillside and demolished the SA-20's radar antenna in a brilliant explosion. Secondary explosions followed as the missile storage bunkers caught fire, but her unconventional tactics had a price. While Sarah had successfully destroyed 2 of the most dangerous radar sites, she was now operating alone in the middle of the enemy's air defense network. Thompson and Martinez were gradually working their way out of the valley, but Sarah was trapped. Her fuel situation was becoming critical. The high-speed maneuvering and maximum power settings required to avoid the missiles had consumed fuel at an alarming rate. Sarah checked her gauges and calculated that she had perhaps 10 minutes of flying time remaining before she would be forced to head home. The radio crackled with Colonel Harrison's voice from the command center. "Desert 2-3, your orders are to disengage immediately and return to base. You've done enough." Sarah looked down at the valley where enemy vehicles were scattered across the landscape. Intelligence would later confirm that her actions had disrupted a major weapons smuggling operation, destroying millions of dollars worth of sophisticated air defense equipment. But the enemy wasn't finished yet. As Sarah turned toward home, her radar warning receiver detected a new threat: enemy fighter aircraft approaching from the north. 2 MiG-29 Fulcrums were inbound at high speed, clearly intent on intercepting the lone American pilot who had just decimated their air defense network. Sarah checked her air-to-air missiles and confirmed that both AIM-120s were ready for launch. The real test was just beginning. Everything she had accomplished so far would be meaningless if she couldn't make it home alive. The MiGs were closing fast, and Sarah was running out of fuel, altitude, and options. But for the first time in her military career, she was exactly where she belonged. In the cockpit of an F-16, facing impossible odds, with only her skill and determination standing between success and disaster. The 2 MiG-29 Fulcrums appeared on Sarah's radar display like deadly ghosts materializing from the digital ether. They were flying in a tactical formation, approaching from different angles to prevent her from engaging both simultaneously. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized she was facing 2 of Russia's most capable fighter aircraft, each piloted by someone who had probably trained specifically to shoot down American F-16s. Her fuel gauge continued its relentless countdown toward empty. Sarah calculated she had perhaps 6 minutes of fuel remaining for combat maneuvering, before she would be forced to fly straight and level toward home, making herself an easy target for the pursuing enemy fighters. Desert 2-3, be advised we have 2 bandits inbound from your northwest. Recommend you egress immediately. The voice of the controller seemed distant and surreal compared to the immediate threat bearing down on her. Sarah armed her AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles and selected Beyond Visual Range Combat Mode on her weapons system. The advanced radar-guided missiles had a range of over 60 miles, giving her a significant advantage over the older AA-10 missiles carried by the MiGs. The lead MiG pilot was evidently experienced, using the mountainous terrain to mask his approach. Sarah caught brief glimpses of the enemy aircraft on her radar as it appeared and disappeared behind ridgelines. The second MiG had climbed to high altitude, positioning itself to dive down on her if she became engaged with the first fighter. At 35 miles, Sarah achieved a solid radar lock on the lead MiG. Her finger hovered over the missile launch button as she waited for the optimal firing solution. The AMRAAM needed several seconds to guide itself to the target, and launching too early would give the enemy pilot time to defeat the missile with countermeasures. The MiG pilot apparently sensed the danger and began evasive maneuvering, turning hard left and dispensing chaff and flare countermeasures. Sarah maintained her lock and waited for the right moment. At 28 miles, she squeezed the trigger. "Fox 3, Sarah announced over the radio, using the standard call for an AMRAAM launch. The missile separated from her aircraft with a brilliant flash and accelerated to over Mach 4, leaving a white contrail as it streaked toward the enemy fighter. Sarah immediately began defensive maneuvering, knowing that the second MiG would likely launch its own missiles in response. Her threat warning system erupted with alarms as the high-altitude MiG launched 2 AA-10 missiles. The Russian missiles were older and less sophisticated than her AMRAAMs, but they were still deadly if she gave them an easy target. Sarah dove toward the ground using the Earth's curvature to break the enemy's radar lock. At the same time, she watched her own missiles progress on the tactical display. The AMRAAM was closing rapidly on the lead MiG, its active radar seeker, guiding it through the enemy pilot's defensive maneuvers. 20 seconds after launch, Sarah's missile found its target. The lead MiG disappeared from her radar screen in a brilliant fireball that briefly lit up the desert floor below. One down, one to go. But the second MiG pilot had used his partner's sacrifice to gain a tactical advantage. While Sarah was engaged with the first fighter, he had maneuvered into an optimal attack position. Now he was diving down from 40,000 feet, with a significant speed advantage, his aircraft loaded with both radar-guided and heat-seeking missiles. Sarah's remaining AMRAAM locked onto the diving MiG, but the enemy pilot was flying an aggressive beam attack, approaching from her side at high speed to minimize the time window for her missile to guide. It was a classic Soviet tactics, designed to exploit the F-16's single-engine vulnerability. At 15 miles, both pilots fired simultaneously. Sarah's AMRAAM streaked toward the MiG while 2 AA-10s raced toward her F-16. The next 30 seconds would determine whether she lived or died. Sarah pulled her aircraft into a violent climbing turn, popping chaff and flares while trying to maintain her missile's guidance lock on the enemy fighter. The G-forces pressed her deep into her ejection seat as she fought to remain conscious under the extreme maneuvering loads. The first enemy missile missed, confused by her chaff and unable to maintain lock through her violent evasive maneuvers. But the second AA-10 was tracking perfectly, its warhead proximity fuse ready to detonate when it reached optimal distance from her aircraft. At the last possible second, Sarah rolled inverted and pulled straight down toward the ground. The AA-10, designed primarily for high-altitude intercepts, couldn't match her rate of descent and streaked harmlessly overhead. Meanwhile, her own AMRAAM was closing on the diving MiG. The enemy pilot, realizing his missiles had missed, began his own defensive maneuvering. But the AMRAAM's advanced seeker head was designed to handle exactly this scenario. The missile adjusted its flight path and detonated its 50-pound warhead just 10 feet from the MiG's cockpit. The second enemy fighter disintegrated in a spectacular explosion, sending burning debris across several square miles of desert. Sarah had achieved something that very few pilots ever experienced: a double kill in air-to-air combat. But her victory celebration was cut short by her fuel situation. The violent maneuvering had consumed her remaining fuel faster than anticipated. Her engine flame-out warning light was already illuminating, indicating that fuel starvation was imminent. Sarah immediately began climbing to optimize her glide distance while frantically calculating whether she could reach friendly territory. The nearest coalition base was still 60 miles away, well beyond the gliding range of her F-16. The radio crackled with Colonel Harrison's voice, urgent but controlled. Desert 2-3, we show you Winchester on missiles. What's your fuel state? Tower, fuel critical. Estimate flame out in 2 minutes. Request vector to nearest recovery field. There was a pause before Harrison responded, and Sarah could hear other voices in the background as the command center worked frantically to find options. Desert 2-3, Al-Dhafra is your closest option at 60 miles. We're launching tanker support, but it won't reach you in time. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. She could eject over enemy territory and hope for rescue, but the chances of survival in the hostile desert were minimal. She could attempt to glide to a road or flat area and try for an emergency landing, but F-16s weren't designed for off-field landings. Or she could try something that had never been attempted before. A deadstick landing at a coalition base 60 miles away in an aircraft that could only glide 40 miles under optimal conditions. As her engine began to surge from fuel starvation, Sarah made her decision. She was going to try to bring her F-16 home no matter what the odds. The backup pilot, who nobody believed in, was about to attempt the impossible. She adjusted her heading toward Al-Dhafra Air Base and began calculating the precise glide profile that might get her within range of the runway. Behind her, 2 columns of black smoke marked the graves of the MiG pilots who had underestimated the woman flying the F-16 that was supposed to be just backup support. Sarah's F-16 engine gave one final surge before falling silent. The sudden quiet in the cockpit was deafening after hours of constant jet noise. Only the whistle of wind over the aircraft's surfaces and the gentle hum of her emergency electrical systems remained. She was now flying a 16,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a falling brick. At 35,000 feet, she had perhaps 12 minutes of gliding time before impact with the desert floor. Al-Dhafra Air Base lay 58 miles ahead, a mathematical impossibility given her aircraft's glide ratio. But Sarah had not survived combat with 2 MiG-29s by accepting impossible odds. The control tower's voice crackled through her headset with barely controlled urgency. Desert 2-3, we show you with engine failure. Al-Dhafra emergency services are standing by. Wind is calm. Runway 21 is available for emergency recovery. Sarah's hands moved automatically across her instrument panel, configuring her aircraft for maximum glide efficiency. She raised her flaps, retracted her landing gear, and adjusted her speed to exactly 220 knots. The optimal glide speed for an F-16. Every knot too fast or too slow would cost her precious distance. Tower, I'm configuring for best glide. Current altitude 35,000, distance 58 miles. Attempting deadstick recovery. Her voice remained steady despite the impossible situation she faced. Colonel Harrison's voice came through on a different frequency, bypassing normal radio protocol. Sarah, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. If you need to eject, we'll get you out of there. Sarah almost smiled at the irony. For months she had been treated as expendable backup. Now when she was facing the most challenging emergency in aviation, her commanding officer was telling her she had nothing to prove. Negative, sir. I'm bringing this bird home. As she descended through 30,000 feet, Sarah began to notice something unusual about the terrain ahead. A massive sandstorm was developing along her intended flight path, with towering walls of dust and debris that could extend up to 50,000 feet. Flying through such a storm in a powered aircraft was dangerous enough. Attempting it in a powerless glider could be suicidal. Her weather radar showed the storm system, stretching across nearly her entire route to Al-Dhafra. There was a narrow gap to the south, but taking that detour would add 15 miles to her flight path, distance she simply didn't have. Sarah made another impossible decision. Instead of detouring around the sandstorm, she would fly directly through it, using the violent updrafts and downdrafts within the storm to extend her glide range. It was a technique that existed only in theory, never attempted in real life. At 25,000 feet, she entered the leading edge of the sandstorm. Visibility dropped to 0 as swirling sand obscured her canopy. The aircraft was immediately buffeted by violent turbulence that threatened to tear it apart. Sarah fought to maintain control as updrafts lifted her aircraft hundreds of feet, then downdrafts slammed her toward the ground. Her instruments became her only connection to reality as she flew blind through the chaos. The artificial horizon tumbled wildly, and her airspeed indicator fluctuated dramatically as she encountered pockets of rising and falling air. Most pilots would have lost control within seconds, but Sarah's years of training in all weather conditions served her well. She learned to read the storm, using its violent energy to her advantage. When she encountered a powerful updraft, she would turn into it, allowing the rising air to carry her aircraft higher. When downdrafts threatened to slam her into the ground, she would use her aircraft's momentum to escape to calmer air. For 20 terrifying minutes, Sarah rode the sandstorm like a surfer riding a massive wave. Her altitude varied wildly between 15,000 and 30,000 feet, as she was tossed around by forces far beyond anything her aircraft was designed to handle. But gradually she began to emerge from the southern edge of the storm system. When she finally broke into clear air, Sarah was amazed to discover that she had gained nearly 15 miles of distance while losing only 8,000 feet of altitude. The storm's updrafts had effectively given her aircraft additional glide range that shouldn't have been possible. Tower, Desert 2-3 is clear of weather. Current position 25 miles south, altitude 27,000. Continuing approach to runway 21. The excitement in the controller's voice was unmistakable. Roger 2-3, we have you on radar. Emergency vehicles are in position. You're cleared for straight-in approach any runway. With 25 miles remaining and 27,000 feet of altitude, Sarah finally had a realistic chance of reaching the airfield. But she still faced the challenge of executing a dead-stick landing in an aircraft traveling at over 200 knots, with no thrust to correct for approach errors. As she began her final approach, Sarah could see Al Dhafra Air Base in the distance. Its runways clearly marked by approach lighting systems. Fire trucks and ambulances were positioned along the runway, their red and blue lights flashing in the desert sun. At 15,000 feet and 15 miles out, Sarah configured her aircraft for landing. She lowered her landing gear and flaps, accepting the increased drag in exchange for better control at lower speeds. Her descent rate increased dramatically, and she had to adjust her approach angle to compensate. The mathematical precision required for a dead-stick landing was extraordinary. Too steep an approach would result in impacting short of the runway. Too shallow would mean overshooting into the desert beyond. Sarah had exactly one chance to get it right. At 10,000 feet, she made contact with the tower for final approach clearance. Tower, Desert 2-3 is 10 miles out, configured for landing. Single approach, no go-around capability. Roger 2-3. Wind calm, altimeter 3002. Runway 21 cleared for emergency landing. All other traffic is holding clear. Sarah could now see individual vehicles and personnel around the airfield. Word of her approach had apparently spread throughout the base, as hundreds of people had gathered to witness the unprecedented emergency landing attempt. At 5,000 feet and 5 miles out, Sarah was exactly on glide path for runway 21. Her airspeed was steady at 180 knots and her rate of descent was manageable. For the first time since her engine had failed, she allowed herself to believe that she might actually succeed. But the desert had one final challenge waiting for her. As she descended below 3,000 feet, Sarah encountered severe thermal turbulence caused by the sun-heated desert floor. Her aircraft was thrown around violently, and she had to fight to maintain her approach angle. The runway threshold was now clearly visible ahead, growing larger in her windscreen with each passing second. Sarah had committed to this approach, and there was no turning back. In 60 seconds, she would either be safely on the ground or scattered across the desert in a ball of flames. The runway threshold rushed towards Sarah at 180 knots, the white-painted lines growing larger in her windscreen with each heartbeat. She had 30 seconds to complete one of the most challenging landings in aviation history, bringing a dead-stick F-16 onto a runway with no margin for error. At 500 feet above ground level, Sarah encountered a massive thermal updraft that lifted her aircraft unexpectedly. For a terrifying moment, she was too high and too fast, threatening to overshoot the runway entirely, with no engine power to correct the approach. She had to rely on pure flying skill and aerodynamic principles. Sarah pulled her throttle to idle position, a meaningless gesture since her engine was already dead, and lowered her nose, slightly to bleed off the excess altitude. The maneuver increased her descent rate dangerously, but it was her only option to salvage the approach. The control tower fell silent as hundreds of people watched the drama unfold. Emergency vehicles positioned along the runway began rolling, ready to respond to whatever outcome awaited. Sarah could see firefighters in their protective suits, ambulance crews with stretchers ready, and crash recovery specialists prepared for the worst. At 200 feet, Sarah was back on glide path but traveling faster than normal landing speed. The F-16's approach speed without engine power was significantly higher than a normal landing, and she would touch down at nearly 200 knots instead of the usual 140. Her landing roll would be correspondingly longer, consuming most of the 13,000-foot runway. "Come on, girl," Sarah whispered to her aircraft, feeling the slight vibration through the control stick that indicated the onset of aerodynamic stall. She was balancing on the knife's edge between controlled flight and uncontrolled crash. At 100 feet, the runway was clearly defined below her. Sarah could see the tire marks from thousands of previous landings, the center line painted in bright yellow, and the touchdown zone markers that indicated her target landing point. Everything depended on the next 10 seconds. Sarah pulled back gently on the control stick, beginning the flare that would transition her aircraft from descent to landing attitude. Too much back pressure would cause a stall and crash. Too little would result in slamming into the runway at a steep angle that could collapse her landing gear. The main landing gear touched down with a tremendous impact that sent shockwaves through the entire aircraft. Sarah felt herself pressed forward against her shoulder harnesses as the F-16's momentum tried to continue down the runway. She immediately deployed her drag chute and applied maximum wheel brakes. The drag chute billowed out behind her aircraft, creating additional drag to slow her speed. But even with maximum braking, Sarah was still traveling at over 100 knots halfway down the runway. The end of the pavement was approaching rapidly, and beyond it lay only open desert. Fire trucks began racing alongside her aircraft, their crews ready to respond if she couldn't stop in time. Sarah could see the concern on the faces of the emergency personnel as they watched her F-16 continue its high-speed roll toward the runway's end. At the 10,000-foot marker, Sarah was down to 80 knots but still traveling too fast. She began applying differential braking, creating slight S-turns on the runway to increase her stopping distance. The technique was dangerous at high speed, but it was her only remaining option. With 1,000 feet of runway remaining, Sarah's aircraft finally rolled to a complete stop. She had used 12,000 feet of the 13,000-foot runway, a margin of safety that measured exactly 1,000 feet. Any approach errors, any misjudgment in her glide path, and she would have ended up in the desert sand beyond the pavement. The silence in her cockpit was profound after the violence of the landing. Sarah sat motionless for several seconds, hardly believing that she had survived. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline, and her entire body ached from the physical stress of the emergency. Emergency vehicles surrounded her aircraft within seconds. Firefighters sprayed foam around her landing gear as a precautionary measure, while medical personnel prepared to assist with her evacuation. The crash recovery team stood ready to tow her F-16 to a safe parking area. Colonel Harrison's voice came through her headset, filled with emotion that he rarely displayed. "Sarah, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed. How do you feel?" Sarah popped her canopy and felt the desert air rush into her cockpit. The heat was overwhelming after the air-conditioned environment of her aircraft, but she had never been more grateful to feel solid ground beneath her wheels. "Sir, I feel like I just flew through hell and came out the other side." Sarah's voice was hoarse from the stress and dehydration of her ordeal, but the aircraft performed perfectly. "She brought me home." As she climbed down from her cockpit, Sarah was immediately surrounded by ground crew members, fellow pilots, and base personnel who had witnessed her landing. The crowd included Major Thompson and Martinez, the two pilots whose lives she had saved during the original mission. Thompson approached her with an expression of genuine respect that she had never seen from him before. "Mitchell, I owe you an apology. What you did today, taking out those SAM sites, shooting down 2 MiGs, and then bringing your bird home with no engine, that's the stuff of legends." Martinez nodded in agreement. "You saved our lives back there. If you hadn't taken out those radar sites, we never would have made it out of that valley." Sarah removed her helmet and wiped the sweat from her forehead. Her flight suit was soaked with perspiration, and her legs were unsteady as the adrenaline began to wear off. But she felt a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond completing a successful mission. "We're all on the same team," she replied. "I just did my job." As the crowd dispersed and the emergency vehicles returned to their stations, Sarah found herself alone with her F-16. The aircraft that had been dismissed as backup support had proven itself to be the most important element of the entire mission. Together they had accomplished something that would be discussed in military aviation circles for decades to come, but Sarah knew that her real victory wasn't the destruction of enemy radar sites or the downing of 2 enemy fighters. Her real victory was earning the respect and acceptance that she had deserved all along. The backup pilot had finally proven that sometimes the backup plan was actually the best plan. Colonel Harrison approached as she completed her post-flight inspection.
Sarah, we need to debrief this mission immediately.
What you accomplished today is going to change how we think about air combat tactics. Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on her F-16. The aircraft showed obvious signs of stress from the extreme maneuvers and dead-stick landing, but the damage was all repairable. Like her pilot, the F-16 had proven itself capable of handling challenges that exceeded all design specifications. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove herself. But today, Captain Sarah Mitchell had transformed from backup pilot to aviation legend. 3 days after her dramatic emergency landing, Sarah found herself in the Base Intelligence Center, surrounded by senior officers and analysts from multiple coalition forces. The debriefing of her mission had revealed far more than anyone had anticipated, and the implications were sending shockwaves through military planning circles across the region. Major General Patricia Rodriguez, the coalition air commander, had flown in personally from Qatar to review Sarah's tactical innovations. The general was a legendary pilot herself, with over 300 combat hours and a reputation for supporting unconventional thinking when it produced results. Captain Mitchell, General Rodriguez began, studying the mission analysis displayed on multiple large screens around the conference room. Your actions 3 days ago have fundamentally changed our understanding of several key tactical concepts. I'd like you to walk us through your decision-making process. Sarah stood before the assembled officers, including Colonel Harrison and several intelligence specialists who had spent the past 72 hours analyzing every aspect of her mission. Satellite imagery, radar tracks, and intercepted enemy communications painted a comprehensive picture of what had transpired over the contested airspace. Ma'am, when I realized that Thompson and Martinez were trapped in the kill zone, conventional doctrine would have called for me to provide high-altitude defensive support while requesting specialized SEAD aircraft. But those assets were over 2 hours away and my wingman didn't have 2 hours. She gestured toward the tactical display showing the valley where the enemy had positioned their air defense network. I made the decision to conduct low-altitude attacks using only my cannon because it was the only way to achieve immediate results. The enemy wasn't expecting a direct assault on their radar sites from an aircraft that was supposed to be providing distant support. General Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. Your first pass destroyed the primary SA-20 site and disrupted their entire targeting solution. But what made you decide to continue the attack instead of withdrawing after achieving that initial success? Sarah had asked herself the same question repeatedly over the past 3 days. Ma'am, I could see that the enemy had prepared a sophisticated trap using multiple overlapping radar systems. Destroying one site would have provided temporary relief, but my wingmen would still have been vulnerable to the remaining threats. I assessed that the tactical situation required complete suppression of the air defense network. One of the intelligence analysts, a civilian contractor with decades of experience, raised his hand. Captain, our post-mission analysis indicates that your attack destroyed over $40 million worth of sophisticated air defense equipment. More importantly, you disrupted a major weapons smuggling operation that was supplying similar systems to terrorist organizations throughout the region. The revelation surprised Sarah. Her focus during the mission had been entirely tactical: protect her wingmen and complete the mission. She hadn't considered the broader strategic implications of her actions. Colonel Harrison spoke up from his position near the back of the room. Sarah's innovation didn't stop with the surface attack. Her engagement with the 2 MiG-29s demonstrated advanced, beyond visual range tactics that we need to incorporate into our training programs. General Rodriguez pulled up the air-to-air engagement analysis on the main display screen. Captain, you achieved 2 kills against modern fighter aircraft while operating alone and with limited fuel. How did you manage to gain such a decisive tactical advantage? Sarah studied the radar tracks showing her engagement with the enemy fighters. Ma'am, the MiG pilots were flying textbook Soviet intercept tactics. They expected me to maintain altitude and fight defensively. When I used terrain masking and vertical maneuvering, I disrupted their attack timeline and forced them to react to my initiatives instead of executing their planned engagement. The intelligence analyst leaned forward with obvious interest. Our assessment indicates that you use the enemy's own aggressive tactics against them. By drawing them into close combat, you negated many of the advantages of their aircraft and weapon systems. General Rodriguez stood and walked to the tactical display, pointing to the sandstorm system that Sarah had flown through during her emergency glide. Now let's discuss what may be the most remarkable aspect of your entire mission. You flew a powerless aircraft through a Category 4 sandstorm and used the storm's energy to extend your glide range. How did you conceive of such a technique? Sarah felt slightly embarrassed by the attention her desperate improvisation was receiving. Ma'am, it wasn't really a planned technique. I was facing an impossible glide distance to reach Al Dhafra, and the storm was blocking my planned route. I had two choices: eject over enemy territory or attempt to fly through the storm and hope for the best. But you didn't just survive the storm, the general continued. You actually used its updrafts to gain altitude and distance. Our meteorology experts have confirmed that your route through the storm system was aerodynamically optimal. You somehow navigated through chaotic turbulence and found the most beneficial air currents. Colonel Harrison smiled proudly. General, Sarah has always demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and adaptive thinking. What she accomplished during that storm transit suggests an intuitive understanding of advanced aerodynamics that most pilots never develop. General Rodriguez returned to her seat and opened a classified folder that Sarah hadn't noticed before. Captain Mitchell, your mission has attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. The Secretary of Defense has personally reviewed your after-action report, and the Joint Chiefs are considering incorporating your tactical innovations into official doctrine. Sarah felt a moment of vertigo that had nothing to do with flying. 3 days ago, she had been dismissed as backup support for a routine reconnaissance mission. Now she was being told that senior Pentagon officials were studying her techniques. Ma'am, I was just doing my job. Everything I did was based on standard training and common-sense tactical thinking. That's exactly what makes your performance so remarkable, General Rodriguez replied. You took standard techniques and applied them in completely non-standard ways to achieve extraordinary results. The ability to innovate under extreme pressure is exactly what we need in modern air combat. She closed the classified folder and looked directly at Sarah. Captain, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to major and assignment to the weapons school as an instructor. Your mission has demonstrated capabilities that we need to share with the entire fighter community. Sarah was speechless. The weapons school was the most prestigious assignment available to fighter pilots, reserved for the absolute best aviators in the air force. Being selected as an instructor there would mean teaching the tactics and techniques that she had developed during her desperate fight for survival. General Rodriguez continued. Additionally, you're being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions during the mission. The citation will recognize your destruction of enemy air defenses, your successful air-to-air engagement, and your innovative emergency recovery technique. As the briefing concluded and the various officers began filing out of the conference room, Sarah remained seated, trying to process the dramatic changes that had occurred in her military career. Colonel Harrison approached and sat down beside her. Sarah, I owe you an apology. For months I treated you as backup support when I should have recognized your capabilities. Your performance on this mission has made me realize that sometimes our most valuable assets are the ones we overlook. Sarah looked at her commanding officer with newfound respect. Sir, being dismissed as backup gave me something to prove. Maybe that motivation made me more willing to take risks that other pilots wouldn't consider. Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that's the lesson we need to learn. Sometimes the backup plan isn't just a fallback option. Sometimes it's the plan that was always meant to succeed. 2 months later, Major Sarah Mitchell stood in front of 40 elite fighter pilots at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, home of the legendary weapons school. The students before her represented the best aviators from around the world, experienced combat veterans who had come to learn advanced tactics that would make them even more effective in aerial warfare. The briefing room was equipped with the most sophisticated simulation and analysis equipment available, including holographic displays that could recreate any combat scenario in 3 dimensions. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this moment, developing a curriculum based on the techniques she had discovered during her mission over hostile territory. Gentlemen and ladies, Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from proven combat experience. Today we're going to discuss adaptive tactical thinking under extreme circumstances. Everything you'll learn in this course is based on real combat experience, not theoretical scenarios. She activated the holographic display, which showed a three-dimensional recreation of the valley, where she had engaged the enemy air defense network. The pilots in the audience leaned forward with obvious interest as they studied the tactical situation. The mission we're analyzing began as routine reconnaissance, but quickly evolved into a complex air defense suppression operation conducted by a single aircraft with no specialized equipment. Sarah gestured toward the display, highlighting the positions of the enemy radar sites. Traditional doctrine would have called for a coordinated seed package with multiple aircraft and dedicated anti-radiation missiles. One of the students, a Royal Air Force pilot with extensive combat experience, raised his hand. "Major, why did you choose to conduct low-altitude attacks instead of requesting proper support assets?" Sarah smiled, remembering when she had asked herself the same question.
Time and geometry.
My wingmen were trapped in a kill zone, and support aircraft were hours away. Sometimes you have to work with what you have instead of what you wish you had. She advanced the display to show her first attack run against the SA-20 site. The key insight here is that enemy operators expect fighter aircraft to behave predictably. They train to engage targets flying at medium to high altitude using conventional approach profiles. By attacking from low altitude at an unexpected angle, I achieved complete tactical surprise. A German pilot spoke up from the back of the room. "Major, our analysis shows that you exposed yourself to significant risk by flying directly through the enemy's engagement envelope. How do you balance aggressive tactics with survivability?" Sarah had wrestled with this question throughout her preparation for the instructor position. The balance between aggression and survival depends entirely on the stakes involved. In this case, 2 Allied aircraft were about to be shot down, and I had the capability to prevent it. The mission requirements justified accepting higher personal risk. She clicked to the next phase of the scenario, showing the air-to-air engagement with the 2 MiG-29s. The fighter engagement demonstrates another important principle, using the enemy's expectations against them. These pilots expected me to fight defensively and try to escape. Instead, I maintained the initiative and forced them to react to my tactical choices. The holographic display showed the missile engagement in real time, with the flight paths of both aircraft and their weapons clearly visible. Sarah could see several students taking detailed notes as they studied the three-dimensional geometry of the engagement. A Navy pilot from the Top Gun program raised her hand. "Major, you achieved 2 kills while operating alone against a numerically superior force. What specific techniques gave you that advantage?" Sarah paused, remembering the intense concentration required during those crucial moments. "Situational awareness and energy management. I used terrain masking to control the engagement timeline, and I exploited the performance differences between the F-16 and the MiG-29. Most importantly, I remained aggressive when the enemy expected me to become defensive." She advanced to the final phase of the scenario, the dead stick landing following her engine failure. This portion of the mission had generated the most interest among tactical analysts, since it represented a completely new emergency procedure. The powerless recovery demonstrates the most important principle of all: never give up. Mathematical calculations said that reaching Al Dhafra was impossible, but mathematics doesn't account for pilot innovation and environmental factors that can be exploited. The display showed her flight path through the sandstorm, with wind vectors and updraft patterns clearly marked. Sarah could see the amazement on the students' faces as they realized the complexity of what she had accomplished. An Israeli pilot who specialized in emergency procedures spoke up. "Major, flying through a Category 4 sandstorm in a powerless aircraft should have been fatal. How did you maintain control in those conditions?" Sarah activated a detailed simulation of the storm environment, showing the chaotic turbulence and zero visibility conditions she had encountered. The key was learning to read the storm instead of fighting it. Updrafts and downdrafts follow predictable patterns if you understand the physics involved. I used the storm's energy as a source of lift instead of viewing it as an obstacle. As the briefing continued, Sarah noticed that the students were beginning to grasp the fundamental lesson she was trying to teach. Innovation in combat wasn't about following predetermined procedures. It was about adapting basic principles to unique circumstances. Colonel Marcus Thompson, The weapons school commandant entered the briefing room during the final phase of Sarah's presentation. He had been monitoring her instruction methods, and his presence indicated that senior leadership was taking close interest in her curriculum development. Major Mitchell, Colonel Thompson announced to the assembled students, has developed what we believe represents the next evolution in fighter pilot training. Her techniques are being incorporated into doctrine at the highest levels of Air Force leadership. Sarah felt a moment of pride as she looked at the faces of the elite pilots before her. These aviators would return to their home units and share the techniques they had learned, multiplying the impact of her innovations throughout the global fighter community. After the students were dismissed, Colonel Thompson approached Sarah with a satisfied expression. "Major, your first week as an instructor has exceeded all expectations. The students are responding well to your teaching methods, and the feedback from their squadron commanders has been uniformly positive." Sarah gathered her briefing materials, still somewhat amazed by the turn her career had taken. "Sir, it feels strange to be teaching techniques that I developed during what I thought was going to be my last mission." "That's exactly what makes your instruction so valuable," Thompson replied. "You're not teaching theory. You're teaching proven combat techniques that saved lives and achieved mission success under impossible circumstances." As Sarah left the briefing room, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been dismissed as backup support, flying routine missions while more experienced pilots received the challenging assignments. Now she was training the next generation of elite fighter pilots in techniques that bore her name in official tactical manuals. Her F-16, tail number 880123, had been repaired and returned to service, but Sarah had been reassigned to a new aircraft, a specially modified F-16 equipped with the latest avionics and weapon systems for her test pilot duties at the weapons school. That evening, as she walked across the Nellis flight line, Sarah spotted her old aircraft preparing for a training mission. The ground crew chief noticed her approach and snapped to attention. "Major Mitchell, good to see you, ma'am. Your old bird is flying again. Good as new." Sarah ran her hand along the aircraft's wing, remembering the desperate flight that had changed everything. "How's she handling?" "Perfect, ma'am. The pilots who fly her now say she has a reputation for bringing everyone home safely." Sarah smiled as she watched the F-16 taxi toward the runway. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as backup support had become legendary among the pilot community. Like her pilot, the F-16 had proven that sometimes the backup plan was actually the plan that was always meant to succeed. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, Major Sarah Mitchell walked toward her new assignment, knowing that her story would inspire future generations of pilots who might one day find themselves dismissed as backup support. She had proven that when the moment demanded it, there was no such thing as a backup pilot. Only pilots who were ready to rise to the challenge.